And hello, everybody. It's really great to have you here and to be here at our second webinar. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Jillian Strayhorn. Jillian earned her bachelor's in psychology from Cornell and her master's and PhD from Penn State, where she worked with me and Dr. Dave Van Ness, who's a professor in health policy and administration at Penn State. Jillian is currently a postdoc working with me at NYU. While at Penn State, Jillian had an F-31 grant from the National Institute on Drug Abuse to support her dissertation work, which was on a very interesting topic, one that I think you will all be interested in. How do you use the results of an optimization trial to make decisions about which components and component levels are to go into the optimized intervention? Jillian brought principles from Bayesian decision analysis into this and extended the ideas so that it's possible to optimize an intervention for value efficiency and also to incorporate several outcome variables in the decision. That's not what she's going to talk about today, but I hope she will do a webinar on that topic in the future. Today, Jillian will discuss an equally interesting topic, conducting informative secondary analyses on data from an optimization trial. We've set aside some time for discussion at the end, but feel free to put a question in the chat at any time. And Jillian, thanks again for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks to you all for being here. And thanks, Linda, for that wonderful introduction. So in this webinar, I will be giving an introduction to mediation analysis based on data from a factorial optimization trial, with a particular focus on how these sorts of mediation analyses can contribute to the optimization of a behavioral or biobehavioral intervention. I'll offer a brief contrast to more traditional mediation analysis based on intervention research, usually on data from a randomized control trial. I'll introduce an empirical example from an optimization trial in weight loss, and I'll discuss how we used factorial mediation analysis in that empirical example. I will not review the very many alternative ways there are to go about mediation analysis. There are many. I'll showcase one way that we used in our empirical example, but I just want to say up front that I'm not necessarily prescribing that as the only way to technically go about mediation analysis. So without further ado, mediation analysis is all about exploring causal pathways. When applied to data from a trial of an intervention, mediation analysis is about exploring the causal pathways that might underlie that intervention's effects on an outcome of interest. The driving question usually is, how is the intervention affecting change? I like to think in terms of a domino analogy. This domino, the special circled domino, is the outcome of interest, and the intervention is a push that is intended to tip some causal chain that leads to an impact on the final domino, the outcome domino. These then are the mediator or mediators that make up the causal pathway that is supposed to lead to the push tipping that final outcome domino. And mediation analyses let us test hypotheses about the domino or multiple dominoes that make up or might make up this causal chain, investigating questions like, is the intervention functioning as intended? Now, in many cases, this may be a matter of investigating what went right in an intervention, what led the push to successfully tip over that final outcome domino. But when done in a more exploratory fashion, similar analyses can also involve investigating what might have gone wrong in an intervention. So, for example, if that final domino doesn't tip. Behavioral and biobehavioral interventions are frequently built upon these sorts of hypothesized causal pathways. So let's say, for example, that we want to reduce HIV viral load for a group of participants. How might we go about this? Well, for one, perhaps we'll try to promote medication adherence, which we're hypothesizing leads to a reduction in HIV viral load. How might we go about promoting medication adherence? Well, maybe by targeting selected behavioral antecedents of successful medication adherence, maybe skills, norms, beliefs, social support. How will we target these important behavioral antecedents? Maybe with different intervention components that are specifically designed to produce these changes. Now, if you're recognizing what's emerging here as a sort of conceptual model, like we've discussed perhaps in terms of the preparation phase of most, then you'd be right. And if so, then these would be our candidate intervention components. So in most, the candidate intervention components are hypothesized to link up to an outcome through these sorts of mediation pathways. Optimization in most is a matter of using an empirical optimization trial to look at the effects individually and combined of these different candidate intervention components, and to strategically balance effectiveness with things like affordability, scalability, and efficiency. Now, exploring whether intervention components seem to be functioning in the intended ways can play a very useful role then in the optimization process. We'll return to this very shortly, but first, let's take a moment to think about how mediation analysis is usually done in intervention research, and then let's contrast that usual practice to the sort of factorial mediation analysis I'm talking about today. So in the classical treatment package approach, which has been used in a widespread way to develop and evaluate biobehavioral interventions, promising components are identified, combined a priori into a package, and then the effects of that package are estimated, for example, using a randomized control trial, say one with 2 arms, maybe a treatment arm, and some sort of suitable control. When an intervention is evaluated in this way, the effect is estimated for the complete package. Notably, usually the effects for the components that make up the package cannot be estimated empirically. So mediation analysis based on data from an RCT, which is very much usual practice in mediation analysis and intervention research, looks at hypotheses about the functioning of the complete intervention package. So in this particular example, single mediator model, which you might recognize has a triangle shape that you frequently see in mediation, the independent variable is the complete intervention and the effect of the complete intervention, for example, as estimated relative to control. And we might test a hypothesis about mediation of the full package's effect, say on weight loss. Does it seem that the effect of the intervention package on weight loss is mediated by something like self-efficacy through an indirect path via that A path and the B path? Now, notably, mediation analysis based on data from a randomized controlled trial cannot extend to testing hypotheses about the components that make up the package. And as we just discussed, since interventions are so frequently built with the idea that different components might be acting via different mechanisms, this means that testing hypotheses about the full intervention package might have limited utility when it comes to decision-making about individual intervention components. A factorial optimization trial that's conducted in an application of most, by contrast, does permit testing hypotheses about the individual components that were identified. We can test hypotheses about mediation of components that seem to have important effects. We can also do exploratory analyses about components that might not seem to have important effects. We can even do some mediation analyses about interaction effects, where we're looking at whether important interaction effects are mediated. So let's get to an empirical example. The opt-in optimization trial was conducted with the goal of optimizing an intervention that would produce weight loss for adults with overweight or obesity. There were 5 candidate intervention components in this trial that were tested using a 2 to the 5th factorial design. Most of the components had the levels on versus off, so that we're testing for the effect of the presence versus absence. But the coaching calls component, which you'll see in this table, had levels high and low, 24 calls versus 12 calls. Mediation analyses with data from opt-in look different, as you might notice right away, from that first mediation model I showed. The first thing that you'll see is different is that now the independent variable is actually variables. Instead of having an effect for a package as estimated in an RCT, we have the main and interaction effects as estimated in the factorial optimization trial. So in this case, there were 5 candidate components, each associated with a 2-level factor. So we have 5 main effects, 1 for the coaching factor, etc., up to the buddy factor. We can also have up to the K-way, or in this case, 5-way interaction effect among these different factors. And in this figure, we strategically used a ... there to imply that there are very many interaction effects. Not all of them are pictured here. In the 2 to the 5th, there are 31 main and interaction effects total. So in this particular figure, the buddy box is shaded slightly. We can focus in on particular pathways, like the one linking the buddy training main effect to the hypothesized mediator, change in self-efficacy for dieting, to weight loss, to explore a hypothesis about the mediation of that particular main effect. And I'll go into some more detail about the analyses for opt-in in just a second. First, I'd like to acknowledge that this is a lot of possible pathways to think about in one single mediator model. So right away, I'd like to acknowledge that in a balanced factorial experiment, like the ones we try to conduct in the optimization phase of most, main and interaction effects are uncorrelated. And this means that we can include these many different main and interaction effects with very little loss of the ability to estimate mediated effects. Furthermore, I'd like to emphasize here that the hypothesis testing we do when we're looking at mediation of these effects is guided by the conceptual model. So we're not necessarily looking at mediation of all of these. We might be focusing on certain pathways that are relevant to the conceptual model that we use to build our intervention. On a technical note, I mentioned at the very beginning that there are many ways to go about mediation analysis. In the analyses we did with this particular empirical example, which I'll detail a bit more next, we used something called the joint significance test to look at mediated effects. With the joint significance test, there's considered evidence for mediation if both the A and B pathways associated with a potential mediator are found to be significantly different from 0. So this is a causal steps approach to mediation analysis that tests 2 null hypotheses. The first is about an association between the hypothesized mediator and the outcome, and the second is about an association between a given independent variable, such as a main effect, and the mediator. So if there is some evidence for mediation, we might find that the A pathway linking a particular main effect and a mediator is significant, and a B pathway linking a mediator with an outcome is also significant. We wrote up a variety of analyses in this paper that was published last year in Translational Behavioral Medicine. I welcome you to check it out if it's of interest. Today, though, I'll focus on analyses of two types. The first, mediation analysis with a significant main effect, which lets us test hypotheses about why a particular intervention component appeared to be useful. And the second, exploratory analysis with a non-significant main effect, which sheds some light on why a certain component appeared to not function in the intended way. So at this starting point here, we're assuming that the optimization trial has been conducted in the optimization phase. The different effects for different factors associated with candidate components have been estimated, as well as interaction effects among those factors. And now we're using mediation analysis to better understand some of the significant main effects and some non-significant main effects. In opt-in, the buddy training component was linked to weight loss in the conceptual model through important social cognitive mediators. And in this case, I focused on self-efficacy as the mediator. So it was thought that including buddy training in the intervention would amplify the intervention's effect on self-efficacy for participants, and specifically self-efficacy for dieting, and that increase in self-efficacy for dieting would lead to more successful weight loss. These are two different types of theory that come together in building these hypothesized pathways. Some people refer to these as conceptual theory, linking the mediator with the outcome, and action theory, linking the particular intervention component with a mediator. So in opt-in, in our factorial mediation analyses of opt-in, we were looking at whether the theory underlying this component's effects appeared to be sound. And it did appear so. So the buddy training factor was associated with a significant increase in self-efficacy for dieting. That's that A path in a classic mediation model. And self-efficacy for dieting was associated with weight loss. That's the B path. So these results suggested that the expectations for buddy training appeared to be at least somewhat sound, that yes, there was that increase in self-efficacy and that increase associated with it with weight loss. This can reinforce the theory underlying these components. And of course, in optimization, one of the goals of conducting an optimization trial is to learn more about the functioning of components just for the greater good of science. But it can also reinforce our decision-making about this component. In opt-in, the decision was to include the buddy training component in the optimized intervention. And a decision like that is always made under uncertainty. So the more information we have about the functioning of a particular component, the better as far as identifying an optimized intervention. Now, moving on to
Jillian, may I interrupt you for a second? We have a couple
Sure.
questions in the chat. So one is kind of thinking back to the figure you showed a little earlier where you had the whole model. The question is, although the main and interaction effects are uncorrelated, do you still correlate those independent variables in the model?
You still correlate them in the model? No. No, so they are all considered sort of independent when we're including them in a particular model.
Okay, so like on a structural equation model, you would not include those curved arrow paths, you're saying?
Right.
Okay. And then the next question is, you might be getting to this, but the figure shown in the example had a single mediator, self-efficacy for all components. Were they all thought to target self-efficacy? What if you have different hypothesized mediators?
Yes. Yeah, and actually that's very relevant to the point we're at right here, where now we're talking about, of course, we're talking now about a factor that did not have a significant main effect, but the mediator here is different. So in a classic conceptual model constructed in the preparation phase, frequently different components will be, each component might be linked to one specific hypothesized mediator of change in the outcome. And so that means that if I can go back to that model, oh no, I overdid it. There we go. So this is focusing on a single mediator. If we have 5 factors in this case, and each one is linked to a specific different hypothesized mediator, that might imply 5 different mediation models. And we can include all of those factors and interactions in each of those 5 different mediation models if we choose to. We can also not include all of them if we are guided by a particular hypothesis that leads us to focus on one particular main effect. The idea is if these are, if the experiment is perfectly balanced, there won't be much consequence to including all of them, but you certainly don't have to. But this is one of the takeaways that I'm hoping to emphasize over the course of this, is that the conceptual model is really important. And this is emphasized for a number of reasons in a lot of the content about optimization. But one of the reasons it's so important here is that that conceptual model informs the mediation analyses that we do. It narrows the number of models that we might consider. And if in this case, there are 5 factors, each linked to a mediator, that's already 5 different mediation models. So you can see how it compounds quickly if there are many possible mediators. I hope that that answered the question sufficiently, at least for now, but I'll continue into talking about these exploratory analyses that were done with a factor that did not have a significant main effect. In the conceptual model for opt-in, the coaching calls factor was hypothesized to be linked to supportive accountability mediators, and through those supportive accountability mediators, weight loss. In the main results for the opt-in trial, however, the main effect for coaching calls was not significant. And so we were using these exploratory analyses to see if we could perhaps get a little bit of a better idea as to why. Again, we're talking about these different theory links, one from the mediator to the outcome and one from the factor to the mediator. And you could imagine that the conclusions might be somewhat different if there's one break in the link versus another. So for instance, if it's found that there's no association between a supportive accountability and weight loss, then even if coaching calls had a significant effect on supportive accountability, we might not see the effect on weight loss because the break was in that association. But in this case, it appeared that the break was in the A path, or the link between the coaching calls factor and supportive accountability. So there was an association between supportive accountability and weight loss as hypothesized, but the coaching calls factor did not have a significant main effect on supportive accountability. Now, I'll also just take this opportunity to remind us that this was a factor that had levels high versus low. And that is perfectly fine from an optimization perspective. However, when we're interpreting results like these, it becomes really important to remind ourselves of those levels. Because in this case, we're not necessarily saying that coaching calls, period, did not have an effect on supportive accountability. We're specifically talking about a main effect for the contrast between 24 calls and 12. So when we thought about what this could mean for the continual optimization of an intervention like opt-in, we thought that maybe one possibility is that 12 doses of coaching calls was enough. And what we're not seeing here is an additional effect for 24 versus 12. Another possibility is that some level between 12 and 24 would be better, and perhaps a subsequent optimization trial could explore these dosings in a different sort of a way. Perhaps 24 is just too many calls. It's also possible that it would be worth considering another intervention component entirely. So maybe a subsequent optimization trial could include 12 coaching calls and a new component that is meant to amplify the effect of coaching calls on supportive accountability. So some sort of booster or something that is intended to add to the effect on supportive accountability. If this was done, then 12 coaching calls could be included, for everybody potentially. It could also be included as another factor, and the test relative to 0 calls could be considered. There are many possibilities, but this comes back to one of the ideas of intervention optimization using MOST, which is that the insights we gather from an optimization trial can not only contribute to the selection of one optimized intervention, but they can also contribute to next steps for continual optimization of the intervention.
A question is, was there a main effect of the 12 coaching calls, or is that something that could not be tested in this design?
Great question. That was something that could not be tested in this particular design. So when this optimization trial was developed, the idea was that there is so much empirical support already for coaching calls that there should be some level of coaching calls. So there was already some empirical evidence that 12 coaching calls was a useful thing to provide to people. And so this particular factor was designed with the question in mind of, is a higher dose of coaching calls better than the sort of usual dose? And the result here suggested that it wasn't. Now, I haven't talked much about mediation of interaction effects. In that paper that we published presenting these results, we also talk about mediation of an interaction effect in opt-in. We also note that behavioral theory that is so key to mediation tends to be rather silent about interaction effects. And so one exciting thing going forward is perhaps factorial mediation analysis can contribute to the development of theory about the mediation of interaction effects. And of course, there are cases where the hypotheses might be a little bit more obvious. So for instance, in this hypothetical I mentioned here, where there might be a component that is included in a trial specifically to amplify the effect of another component, maybe in that case, there is underlying that idea at least something of a hypothesis about an interaction. Namely, we're thinking that these are working together synergistically to support, an effect on supportive accountability. And in that case, if that optimization trial is conducted, perhaps it would make sense to look at factorial mediation analysis of an interaction effect between those two factors, if they are treated as factors. So I'll approach a conclusion with some collected recommendations for factorial mediation analysis. And I'll try to leave more time for questions and discussion. And I've alluded to this first recommendation a little bit already, but a good conceptual model is really key to factorial mediation analysis. And I also say here that less can be more. And if you've heard others, including others on this webinar, talk about the conceptual model, you might be familiar with this recommendation to identify one hypothesized mediator for each particular factor. And one of the reasons that can be really useful is that the picture then for mediation analyses becomes a lot clearer. We're hypothesizing that this component is being included to target this behavioral antecedent of the outcome. And if that's not happening, it's noteworthy. If multiple potential or multiple factors are targeting the same mediator, that can be okay, but the mediation analyses might be a little bit more complex. I also note that measurement of our putative mediators really matters, and especially in terms of timing. So mediation with its domino chain is a temporal process. There's change that's happening in one thing, leading to another thing, leading to another, and then to the outcome. And that means that if we're going to try to capture that causal process, our measurement needs to be done very carefully. If we're measuring everything at the same time, the mediators, the outcomes, the picture isn't as clear that mediation is actually taking place here. And of course, in general, when we're measuring these mediating constructs, we're hopefully doing so in a way that captures the sort of change that we're interested in. That might mean some repeated measures. There are various strategies for the very many possible mediators that are out there. But it just means that in the planning of an optimization trial, if the goal is eventually to do factorial mediation analysis, it's really important to think about the timing of measurement and whether that will be appropriate for capturing mediation. And then a final note to use some caution in interpreting null results, because it can be beneficial, I think, to do the sort of idea generating that I've modeled with the analysis from a non-significant main effect and opt-in. But of course, we're talking about something that is simply not significant from a hypothesis testing perspective. And so null results always can mean a lack of power or an inadequate measurement strategy and so on. And it's sometimes important to take care not to necessarily interpret it as meaning something in particular. But again, back to the conceptual model, the stronger those initial hypotheses are, the more we might actually also have a chance of investigating what is going wrong when we turn to later analyses. So I think I'll pause here and see if there are more questions either that anybody would like to shout out or in the chat. Yes.
Hi, Jillian. Thank you so much. So I have two questions that may be really rudimentary, but I'm going to ask them anyway.
Sure,
The
please.
first is, so if we're doing a factorial mediation analysis using the examples you gave us, so the coaching calls, we didn't see a main effect with supportive accountability, sorry, supportive oncology, I wanted to say, with supportive accountability, but because as we're making conceptual models, sometimes it's muddy, right? What it's affecting. And yet now I totally understand why you want us to choose one. Can I go back and say, okay, the coaching calls themselves did not have, impact via mediation analysis, supportive accountability, but they did impact self-efficacy, or they did impact motivation? Or is that kind of like, no, this is like post hoc and you're kind of trying to make something of it? So that's my first question. And my second question is, if you have time at the end, as I'm starting to, go through from our last intensive, I was creating kind of my conceptual model. I'm getting a lot of pushback on trying to bring in two theories. And so if there's time at the end, I'd love you to talk about ways to move in, to weave in the conceptual theory and the action theory. Thank you.
Sure, yeah. So to get at your first question, I do think that as far as science court, some of Linda's writing refers to this idea of a science court and the rules that the court thinks in terms of. There is something in the scientific process that is special about these a priori hypotheses that were, defined from the get-go. However, I do think it can be useful if it's noted as, there was this hypothesized link and there's not evidence of that in our results. It can also be noted that exploratory analyses were done in other mediation and models that suggest that coaching calls did have an effect on some other mediator. And so I do think that sort of exploring can be useful and can be accepted by the scientific community, but it is important to note sort of the exploratory nature to that work.
And just to follow up, in your experience, would you suggest to stake out a priori those exploratory analysis if when your conceptual model, there's two things that may be closely, are you better off to kind of look authentic to do that a priori, that in the exploratory analysis we're also going to look for, or is that really muddying the water?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there perhaps can be a little bit of a balance that's struck between, noting a few other exploratory analyses that might be anticipated, but without saying, and then we're also going to look at this and this and this, and getting too many that are planned, at which point it might just get to be muddy, as you've said. But another thing that I'll note is in the example with coaching calls in this particular trial did not have a significant main effect on the outcome. And if we were finding, let's say, that self-efficacy is a mediator in other models, it has that association with weight loss, and coaching calls has a statistically significant effect on self-efficacy, that might have really manifested itself in a significant main effect for the factor on weight loss, if our mediation theories are sound here. So something like that might not be the most likely sort of result to find. One thing though, if a factor does have a significant main effect, on the outcome of interest, but it does not have a main effect on its hypothesized mediator, then perhaps it has a significant main effect on another. And so we would be noting that the original theory was not supported. There's not evidence behind that original theory, but in an exploratory fashion, we might find associations with other mediators.
Jillian, can I just jump in to remind and maybe just state that the conceptual model is not a measurement model, right? The purpose of the conceptual model is to depict your intervention and the process that you're changing. And so the measurement model is just as important, but it's not reflected, like all those arrows are not necessarily reflected on the conceptual model.
Right. Harley, how about your question?
Yeah, so one of the things I've been thinking about, I'm in the process of putting in an R00, and something I got pushed back on was like including mediators as an aim, because of this notion that, well, if there's, it makes the aims interdependent. Because, you know, if you don't have a main effect of your intervention component on your outcome, then you can't test for mediation, which I know there's different schools of thought on that. So I was curious, like, how you guys have couched these mediation analyses in previous successful grants, and if you can talk about kind of the strategy around that.
Yeah, I will also invite Kate and Linda, who have cumulatively a lot of grant writing experience, to speak up here if you'd like. But yes, the different perspectives on mediation analysis is a challenge. Some people think that you have to have that total effect that's established before you can start to think about mediation analysis at all. And of course, there is an important contrast. I try always when speaking to reserve mediation for looking at the analyses with, say, a significant main effect, and the analyses with the non-significant main effect are more exploratory. And I'm not sure how that would go over in a grant writing sense. But I know there have been very successful grants that have proposed this as an aim, in addition to the overall look at the optimization trial. Kate or Linda, do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, I think what we're proposing is a little different from a standard mediation analysis, and in a grant proposal that probably needs to be pointed out. Because we have the data from the optimization trial, it makes a lot of sense here to look at the causal pathway even when there's no main effect, because what you want is to learn why there's no main effect. And that's not something you can really do if you have a treatment package RCT. That wouldn't be very illuminating. But here it is, because of the factorial experimental design and the kind of information it gives us. So I think that's something important to point out to reviewers. They won't necessarily see it unless you kind of say, hey, this is different, a little bit different. It's mediation analysis, but it's a little bit different from what you've been thinking. There's opportunities here that there aren't with a standard treatment package RCT. And in fact, I think it's important to do these kinds of analyses, because one of the great benefits of a factorial optimization trial is that it enables you to pinpoint what are the weak parts of an intervention. Mm-hmm. Even if every single component shows a significant effect on the outcome, I would still want to do a bunch of these kinds of analyses.
I was just going to add, Linda, your point about improving the intervention. We also talk about how optimization allows for improvement of the theory, right? And like
Yeah.
moving science forward and not. So just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kate. And it really bothers me that we seem to be calling on theory at the front end, but not really ever going back and revising our theories after we've conducted an empirical analysis. And that's, I mean, there's a number of aspects of modern intervention science that and I think others who work in this area are see as holding us back, and that's one.
Thank you. Super helpful.
There's a question in the chat. You presented simple mediation models, one independent variable, one mediator, for examples, but you could develop a more complicated model with multiple independent variables and mediators using factorial data, right? Albeit maybe not using a particular stat method you did. I'm unclear on if it was a necessity or just a function of what you chose to present.
Yes, so absolutely, you could include multiple independent variables. And in fact, when I was discussing these particular results, I narrowed in on the pathways that made up a specific triangle. So for instance, linking buddy training to the hypothesized mediator to the outcome. But these were all from the sorts of single mediator models that I showed before that had all 31 main and interaction effects included. And so we're looking actually at mediation of all of those, but focusing in on the ones that we have these hypotheses about. And you can include multiple mediators as well. When you do that, and you also have 31 independent variables, you start to have a lot of arrows. And in the paper, we actually discuss results from one multiple mediator model that we used. So with the buddy training factor, there were a few other sort of secondary hypothesized mediators for buddy training. And we looked at a multiple mediator model to look at those. And that was sort of getting at the relative importance of these different mediators, which is just a slightly different purpose. But that can absolutely be done as well.
Yeah, I would add for more details about these analyses, looking at the paper would probably be good, the paper in Translational Behavioral Medicine.
Yes.
Jillian, can you talk a little bit about how one would handle missing data in this kind of an analysis?
Yes. So in this case, the opt-in trial had sort of your typical level of missing data for a longitudinal intervention. And we approached it using full information maximum likelihood. And we also included in our structural equation models some of the other mediating variables as auxiliary variables to contribute to the missing data model. And of course, that was the strategy we picked for this one, and there are a variety of options in that too. But actually having these mediators from a missing data perspective, doing the modeling with these mediators versus in the main outcomes for a factorial optimization trial, where you might be working with the the factors and the outcome, the mediating variables also contribute to that missing data model in a nice way.
And where would you say these analyses fit into the phases of most?
Yeah, so I would say if we think in terms of figure some of you might have seen where there's a preparation box leading to an optimization box leading to some decision making that leads into an evaluation box. These analyses, I would say thinking about them is critical to the preparation phase because you're thinking about hypothesized mediation as you're building the intervention. But these analyses themselves tend to be done as secondary analyses based on the results of the optimization trial conducted in the optimization phase. And they can be particularly useful in contributing to the decision-making process, both in terms of selecting an optimized intervention, but also in terms of making really important decisions about what comes next. So is the next step to pick an optimized intervention and move to evaluation of that optimized intervention, or might it be to do another optimization trial, particularly if, you know, lots of factors, as we've touched on, do not have significant main effects. These might inform the next step for continual optimization.
Jillian, I just wondered if you could speak just into what you were talking about to proximal versus distal outcomes. And I'll just clarify kind of my thought. So, you know, social support is really big in young adult cancer survivors. And so I want to look at that as a candidate component in a physical activity intervention. The proximal outcome may be engagement. The distal outcome may be actual physical activity levels during, you know, chemotherapy. How might that, you know, how might this hypothesized mediation need to be considered for proximal and distal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you know, mediation is all about those sorts of hypothesized causal pathways. And we sort of, at a certain point, when I think of those dominoes again, at a certain point, we call that last domino the outcome. But if we, you know, change our time scale a little bit, a more proximal domino could be the outcome. So there's sort of, you know, it depends somewhat on how someone is thinking about their particular model, what is considered a mediator and what is considered an outcome. And so sometimes in an optimization trial, there will be measurement of one or more proximal outcomes that can be measured on the time frame that the optimization trial takes place. And those are being hypothesized to lead to a distal outcome, so much so that we're comfortable basing a decision on those proximal outcomes. If we had data all the way to the distal outcome, we might look at those in a mediation model and see if those proximal variables mediate that distal outcome, but we don't, because we're, you know, operating on a specific time scale. So there is just a little bit of nuance here in terms of what is considered an outcome and what is considered a mediator. Does that get at what you were thinking about?
In the chat, this question has appeared. How might the mediation models inform your decisions about an optimized intervention in a way that is different from the main analyses in the factorial experiment?
Yeah, so, you know, the answer to that question, of course, might depend on how people are approaching their decision-making process. But just to give an example, when we decide to include a particular component, Again, we might have outlined some theory about how that component acts and what it's doing. And so when we're including it, we might be doing so with the idea that it is sort of serving that function. And if the theory, there isn't evidence to support the theory, but we're still deciding because there is that link with the outcome to include it, we might make the decision to stick to the actual effect on the outcome and make a different decision to continue to investigate what explains the effect of that component. But it's sort of a matter of reinforcing potentially our decision making or adding further considerations we might want to think about, for example, in the evaluation that comes next. If we have some continuing questions about certain components that might shape how we proceed with evaluation, it also might shape, subsequent trials. But usually it's a matter of, how much reinforcement of the decision is there or not.
Can you talk a little bit, you talked about time.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally feel that time is so important in mediation, and it's that is under acknowledged how important it is. And you talked about the measurement model. And the measurement model, I think, is made up not only of what measures are used and their reliability and so forth, but also when things are measured.
Right.
So can you talk about how when you choose to measure things potentially could have an effect on your results when you conduct a mediation analysis?
Yes, certainly. Yeah. So if we find that there is not evidence to support the theory about, say how a particular component is functioning, it very well could be that what that means is that we haven't measured the construct in the way we needed to capture that change. And so maybe we measured too soon and the change hadn't happened yet. Maybe we measured too late and we, weren't able to still capture that particular change. Maybe we didn't have enough instances of measurement to capture the sort of longitudinal process we were thinking about. Of course, the measure itself might have been inadequate. But, I think so often in designing trials about when we're going to measure the outcome. In this particular empirical example, there was a lot of thought about measuring the outcome, weight loss, at 6 months, because in the weight loss literature, there's a real emphasis on this particular time point. But then the mediators were measured at 3 months, and all of them were measured at 3 months. There is less in the literature in general about, when in the temporal process you should look for a change in self-efficacy, or when you should look for a change in supportive accountability. So sometimes there's not a large amount of evidence to go off of in this sort of planning, and that can make it challenging. But it's certainly a very high priority consideration.
Okay, any last questions for Jillian?
Okay, so I'm posting this link in the chat. The applications for our May training on intervention optimization is open. It's due March 17th. And if you have questions, feel free to email cadio@nyu.edu. Anne Marie is our spokesperson.
I'm pushing, but I got to tell you, you guys need to give us a quick cheat sheet. I was at a seminar yesterday and I asked a question about optimization because it would have been perfect. And the gentleman, who was brilliant in every other way, we talked about how ineffective an optimization trial was. And I realized I'm too naive to say the right trigger points. So I want you to give us little cheat sheets that I can put on a Post-it. Like Kate, I wanted that picture, which is, I was like, I'm not going to be able to scroll through Twitter, and not that we want to correct, but I think just
educate maybe.
Yeah, some like quick
Well,
key points, because I think there's such a lack of knowledge, and from what I'm learning from all of you, there's so much to be celebrated about this. So
yes.
so in your spare time that you all have tons of, I would love a little cheat sheet for those of us, so we can
well, I'll just say, Anne Marie, that our May webinar is a Ask Linda and Kate, and Linda would love to debate folks.
Yeah, if anyone wants, I would love some crabby people to show up for that webinar. If anybody wants to give us some attitude, we're ready for that.
Thank you guys.
Thank you, Jillian, so much.
Thank you, Jillian. That was great.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, bye-bye.